as you can imagine, a team effort with many hundreds of colleagues across the UK government, and indeed as part of our international network who are involved in getting this over the line. I mean, my own assessment on this is that I do think that the Glasgow Climate Pact is a historic agreement, and you know, putting it in the context that we live in a pretty fractured world politically, to have managed to get almost 200 countries to agree to this, I do think is an achievement. As I said, it's not just an achievement for the UK, but I think the fact that we had almost 200 countries agreeing to this, I think shows the level of interest there is in working on this agenda internationally. So in terms of what we achieved, I mean, perhaps it's worth just pointing out what we set out as our objectives at the start. And we were very clear right from the start that we wanted to be clear on elaborating to the world, in fact, when we spoke to governments, what we were looking to achieve. And our overarching ambition was to keep the goal of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees within reach. And as part of that, we focused on three areas. One was on mitigation. So we were asking countries to improve their NDCs, their 2030 NDCs, but also set out commitments to net zero by the middle of the century. We asked them to do more in terms of finance, so that $100 billion goal, but also private finance as well. And then on adaptation as well, we wanted to see much more focus given to adaptation. For certainly in all the discussions I had with many developing nations, they remarked on the fact that adaptation has historically been seen as a poor cousin of mitigation, and they wanted a rebalancing in terms of the way that adaptation is approached in international climate discussions. And the final thing that we want to do was, of course, close off the Paris rulebook. I mean, Paris was a historic agreement, but the detailed rules were left to subsequent COPs, and there were still, I think, the thorniest issues outstanding after 6 years, and it was very important for us that we close this off. This may sort of sound obvious, but we were also very determined this was a physical event as well. You know, right up to the last few weeks of COP, there were you know, some voices calling for this to be postponed. Again, we were very clear that this is something that had to go ahead. Climate change hadn't taken time off in the 1 year that we had already postponed COP. So those were our objectives. In terms of where we got to, I do think there is a consensus that we have ensured that 1.5 remains alive. If you look at some of the analysis that's out there, suggests that before the Paris Agreement, we were heading towards 4 degrees of global warming, some estimates suggesting 6 degrees. You know, after Paris, heading towards 3 degrees. And as a result of the commitments that we have got in Glasgow, assuming they're all delivered, we are heading towards below 2 degrees. So I think we can say that we kept 1.5 alive. And I mean, just to give you an example in terms of mitigation, when we kicked off, 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We are now at over 90% of the global economy covered by a net zero target. We had over 150 enhanced NDCs submitted during the period of our presidency designate. And we've also, for the first time ever, got an agreement from almost 200 countries on a ratchet to come back by the end of this year to look again at their 2030 emission reduction targets. And I don't think very many people expected that we would do that. On finance, we've set out a delivery plan working with our German and Canadian colleagues, which shows that we will reach 100 billion at the latest by 2023. It may come earlier, and that over a 5-year period from 2021 to 2025, we are expected to get to the $500 billion as well. And, you know, I'll invite Nigel if he wants to say a little bit more about some of the private finance initiatives. Again, on adaptation, agreement from developed countries to double the amount of adaptation finance by 2025 on a 2019 base year. And then, of course, we move things forward as well in terms of the global goal on adaptation and loss and damage. And we closed off the Paris rulebook. Again, I think there were lots of people who were pretty skeptical that we would do this, but we managed to close this off. You know, some other sort of historic firsts, for the first time ever at a COP, we managed to get coal in the cover decisions. This had not happened before. And, obviously at the end of the COP, there was all that discussion around what the wording should be. But, we managed to get coal in there, which I think is a historic first, and a range of other areas where I'll ask Nigel if he wants to elaborate on coal and cars and trees, etc., where we got, I think, a number of firsts over the line. But what I would say to you is that, and I acknowledged this in Glasgow as well, despite all the commitments that were made, the pulse of 1.5 degrees is weak. And therefore, we now have to work together with our colleagues in Egypt, who hold the COP27 presidency, to ensure that there is a delivery plan so that all these commitments that have been made do actually come to fruition. And that is what we are working on during this year. And I'm sure my colleagues can elaborate a little more on that. If I may, with your permission, just hand over to Nigel Topping, who might briefly want to talk about the commitments that came from non-state actors as well, which was quite a unique feature, I think, of this particular COP.
That will be absolutely fine. And just to say, Nigel, I'm sorry, I didn't see that you were in the waiting room right at the beginning. So just for the record, can I state that this is Nigel Topping, who is the high-level champion for COP26. So over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, and thank you, COP President, for the introduction and invitation. I'll just briefly, for those of you who don't know, the role I have was created as part of the Paris Agreement, precisely to drive action in non-state actors. It's the term the UN uses, which basically means the private sector and local governments, so cities and states, many of whom, of course, are much bigger than many of the parties to the UN Convention. So I'd like to start by saying I think that the UK presidency, I think, really stands out as being the first presidency that really embraced this agenda, so that we were working hand in hand, driving action by governments around the world and action by the private sector and local governments. And that feedback between the two is part of what has helped drive more ambition, because we know that if a government sets a really ambitious target, it's much easier for private sector to invest, but also the private sector and cities are going ahead of governments in some countries in the world where the national governments aren't so bold. It actually changes the politics as well. So we've worked very closely with the Chilean presidency to create 3 campaigns to drive momentum to support the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: so mitigation, resilience, and finance. And if I could go on forever, but I'll just give you a few highlights. The COP president mentioned finance. A couple of years ago, there were hardly any asset owners or asset managers even thinking about net zero, and working very closely with Mark Carney, we launched the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. We now have over $130 trillion of assets around the world committed to financing that transition to net zero. That's really in the implementation phase now. That number grew very quickly, so we're working very closely this year on how to finance that transition in sector after sector, and also in different regions around the world where the challenges are different. And then amongst the business community, we have thousands of businesses committed to net zero, and not just net zero in 2050, but the short-term actions this year. And a year ago, the COP president launched what we call the 2030 breakthroughs, which are very specific goals of actually mobilizing capacity at a cost level in green steel, green hydrogen, electric vehicles, and in total 30 sectors. And that's really the private sector counterpart to the Glasgow breakthroughs, which were launched in Glasgow with many governments committing to those. So we've now got this really nice public and private dynamic. And even in the last week, you'll have seen, for example, in Glasgow, we had a lot of countries and companies committing to 100% electric vehicles by 2035. Last week, you might have seen Chrysler committed to being 100% electric by 2028. So the more we converge on these short-term goals, the more it de-risks investment and allows us to go faster and faster. So a couple of other areas. Energy, we're seeing a significant acceleration in the phasing out of coal. We now have 48 subnational governments joining the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and many members of GFANZ committing and putting their plans in place to stop financing any new coal, and now some interesting creative solutions looking at how we can finance the early retirement of existing coal assets, which is going to be necessary for us to reach net zero globally. Also, we worked to launch an African and Latin American green hydrogen alliance, as well as a green hydrogen catapult, aiming at getting the cost of green hydrogen down to $2 per kilogram by 2026. And again, another example of how the more people converge on these goals, the more ambition rises. When we launched a year before COP, the target was to get to 25 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolysis actually deployed by 2026. And that target has gone up with real confidence from the private sector by 80% in only 12 months. I could go on, huge progress in terms of offshore wind. Also the movement towards standardizing disclosure. I mean, the UK's moved there, very welcome. That work's been largely led by the NGOs and the private sector with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So the announcement that UK firms will have to publish plans to net zero, very welcomed by that huge finance community. And then the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. I mentioned cars, it's a personal obsession, but we really see that combustion engine ending much sooner, and on sector after sector. But I'll leave it there, Chair. But general impression that working together of the public and the private has really given confidence to everybody, which is now manifesting in this exponential take up of clean technology. So the costs come down accordingly, which is part of what drives that. Thank you.
Peter, are you trying to come in on that one?
I wasn't sure how you wanted us to indicate, Chair, so I just stuck my hand up. Just 2 points I wanted to make. The first is, although this is all about COP, the last 2 years have been a sort of coordinated diplomatic campaign, and a number of important points on the way, and that I'm sure will be true in the year ahead. And just to pick out two, the G7 and the G20 last year were very significant, I think, in setting some of the framework for COP26. The second is what's happening to international finance for fossil fuels, I think, is worth picking out. So we had a stretch target for ourselves of ending international coal financing by COP26, which was quite challenging, but we managed it well in advance, with Japan, then Korea and China agreeing to do that. And then something which I think has not perhaps got as much attention as it might have, which is that in the days, weeks leading up to COP and at COP itself, most of Western Europe and North America committed to ending all public support overseas for fossil fuel by the end of 2022, rather as the UK had done a couple of years ago. And I think if you'd said to anybody 6 months ago that that was possible or achievable, I don't think you would have been treated seriously. So I think that was a significant and to my mind, slightly underreported achievement, not least because it should liberate over time significant volumes of investment for other technologies and particularly green technologies.
Thank you for that, and for all of you setting out the considerable achievements. I just wondered, COP President, if there were any disappointments.
Well, I think obviously, you always want to go further and faster. Obviously, would have liked to seen more NDCs come forward, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about how we might do work in relation to the ratchet. Obviously, on the final day, there was the discussion around the language on coal. And, the language settled on phase down. But again, there was a sort of historic first. I mean, I remember sitting down with Peter and the team a year ago when I went full time to this. And I remember saying, all of us remember sort of talking about the fact that we wanted to get coal in these cover decisions. We wanted to get fossil fuel subsidies in the cover decisions. And right from the start, if you look back, we said, one of the things we wanted to do was for this to be the COP where we consign coal power to history. And this had never happened before. And there are lots of people incredibly skeptical we would ever get this kind of language right up to the last minute in the cover decisions. But we did. I think that the key issue, Chair, now is that we have managed to extract lots of commitments from countries, also from the private sector, and there is actually quite a lot of goodwill. I think this is one area on climate where we are able to interact very constructively with other countries. The issue now over this year is to ensure that we keep up the momentum going into COP27, so people at the end of this year can say, yes, those commitments that were made are actually being delivered upon.
Thank you for that. Can I now hand over to Baroness Northover?
Thank you very much indeed, and hope that you can hear me all right. And speaking of momentum and the importance of delivering the aims of COP26 right across governments and at the heart of governments, I wondered if you could tell me how many staff within the Cabinet Office will be working to support the delivery of COP26 outcomes. And there we're looking for full-time equivalents there.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Baroness Northover. So I think just to put this in the context of where we were during last year. So I think in steady state, we had around 220 people working in the COP unit itself, sitting in the Cabinet Office, and obviously Peter Hill is CEO of that setup. But we obviously had lots of support from other departments as well. Indeed, at the COP itself, you will have seen during the two weeks, each day there was a theme. So whether it's a transport theme or an energy theme or finance theme, we then had support from the relevant departments across government. So there was a big cross-government effort on this. And also, I think, as Peter said, the last couple of years, there was a big diplomatic effort. So, we have around 460 climate attaches. That they're not necessarily doing full-time climate, but we've got 460 climate attaches across the UK's diplomatic network, and they were incredibly important as well. Obviously, what we don't have to do this year is organise a big conference. And so our view is that we are looking at 140 to 150 people during this year. Again, a good number of people. But I think if we want to deliver and work with countries to deliver on all of these commitments, we're going to need that level of commitment within the COP unit itself. And then, of course, we will continue to work across government. So there was, for instance, during the last couple of years, we have set up organizations. So we've got the Energy Transition Council, where, again, that's a sort of cross-government effort, working with BEIS and other departments. You've got the zero emissions, the Transport Transition Council as well, in terms of zero emission vehicles. And again, that's working with the Department of Transport. So, I do expect that we will continue to work across government on this agenda. But in terms of the number of people within the Cabinet Office focused on this, 140 to 150. And what I will do with your permission is ask Peter, if Peter wants to sort of set out a little bit more about the detail of what we expect that team to be doing during this year. And then I think Nigel may want to comment as well in terms of the team that he has around him to support him as the high-level champion. Obviously, this was the first COP where we had such a big focus on ensuring that it wasn't just commitments and negotiations coming from countries, but also from the private sector as well. And we're very keen to push that work forward. So I don't know, Peter, whether you want to sort of comment on what these 140 and 150 people are going to be doing.
Yeah, very happy to. I'll try not to bore you with too much detail. So although we don't have, detailed rulebook negotiations to settle in the way that we did in the run-up to Glasgow, we have a huge number of obligations and commitments which we've taken on and set up at Glasgow. And I think, we'll all be judged on whether those are made real or not. So on adaptation, there's a series of outcomes and work programs, as there are on loss and damage. Of course, what we're calling in the jargon, the ratchet on mitigation, which has to deliver in 2022, plus all the work on the long-term future finance goal. So this is the finance goal after 2025. So although there won't be legions of people necessarily working on the common time frames or the transparency framework, there will be a lot of people working to deliver those agreements. So finance, for example, is going to be an absolute key focus in 2022, mobilizing public and private, seeing if we can bring together those in a blend, rather as we did for South Africa. Forgive me if you're aware, but at COP we brought together a coalition of countries to support the transition of the power sector in South Africa, and there's a number of other places around the world where we think that would be worth pursuing. We'll need people to do that. The diplomacy that's going to need to persuade people and encourage them to come forward with stronger commitments is not something that can be done quickly, lightly, or on a shoestring. There's a huge part to do in engaging and mobilizing partners around the world, both state and non-state, etc., etc. There is even though there isn't some of the detail of the negotiations to do, there is a huge amount to deliver on Glasgow, and that's what I think we need the team for. Over.
Nigel, you want to say anything about?
Yeah. As well as the government team, one thing we've done outside of government, because the champion's role is this kind of arm's length nature, is build a team to really, in response to the COP25 mandate we were given to take the work of the Marrakesh Partnership, which is what we call the big coalition of organisations working with cities and businesses and investors, to the next level. Historically, that's been very, very lightly resourced. So we put together a global team to support that with the intention of future-proofing the momentum. We presented that on the penultimate day of the COP, and it was very well received by the parties, ranging from the USA at one level to the small island states who were very enthusiastic about it. So that team globally will have order of magnitude 120 full-time. They won't be on government. There won't be government staff, and in particular, we're looking to regionalise around Latin America, Africa, and Asia, where a lot of the heavy lifting remains to be done, and that's to cover the race to zero and the breakthroughs, the race to resilience, and the Glasgow Finance Alliance as well.
Thank you. Can we now move to Lord Lucas?
Thank you very much, Chair. President, what is the government doing to ensure effective cross-government delivery of the COP26 outcomes? And in your response to the committee's letter, you referred to a commitment in the net zero strategy to publish an update on progress against a set of key indicators for achieving our climate change goals on an annual basis. What progress has been made on taking forward this commitment, and what scrutiny will there be of the agreed indicators?
Great, thank you very much for that, Lord Lucas. So I think your first question is, effective cross-government delivery. So I think, as I said, in the last couple of years, we have worked, I think, pretty effectively cross-government in terms of putting together COP26 and ensuring that Secretary of States in their discussions with counterparts around the world have also been taking the messages on the need to do more in terms of NDCs, the need to do more in terms of clean energy, in terms of clean transport. And that is something that we will continue. But what we've also had for the past couple of years is a cabinet committee called the Climate Action Implementation Committee, which I chair. This has allowed us to have a discussion both in terms of coordinating domestic policy, but also in terms of our COP commitment. So I mean, we will be using the CAI committee. One element of that will be to ensure that we're working closely together across government on delivering on the COP outcomes. In terms of the net zero strategy and basically sort of setting out how we're going to show the progress on delivering net zero. Obviously, the net zero strategy was a strategy formally published by the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. They are looking at this particular issue right now in terms of how they show progress, what are the sort of particular metrics that one would look at, and I think that is there is quite a lot of detailed thinking going on within BEIS. So I'm not in a position at this stage to set that out, but if I may suggest, it may be helpful actually if the chair or your committee was to write to the business department with this particular question. And I know they're giving it a great deal of thought right now. So hopefully they will be able to respond in some detail. What they do though, of course, is every year they publish an updated energy and emissions projections report. The last one came out at the end of 2020, looking at the 2019 figures and basically analysing and projecting the future energy use and the greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. I mean, actually, it's actually pretty useful document, and sets out where we are in terms of performance in relation to our various carbon budgets, where we expect to be in the future, and that, of course, then provides input in terms of where we need to do more in terms of policy development, so that we're able to meet our carbon budgets and, of course, ultimately net zero by 2050.
Thank you very much, President. Can I just ask as a supplementary to that, picking up on Professor Dasgupta's final words on education and on what I hope you agree is the importance of education and young people's opinions in changing behaviours in society and changing attitudes. Can you outline how your committee has purchase on something like the Department for Education? I mean, they announced some nice but pretty thin things at COP. They haven't touched the core curriculum. How over the next year do you intend to encourage them to do more?
Yeah, so I think the Department for Education actually did set out quite a lot of new commitments on the issue of on climate change, and I'm very happy to write or request that department to write and set that out. And this was the first COP where I think we were able to get both education and sort of climate ministers together looking at these issues. I was in fact at the pre-COP in Milan, where the whole issue of education and sort of climate education came up. And as I said, I think at COP26 was the first time we got into this discussion. I mean, I would say more widely that, I mean, I agree with you that actually the voice of youth, civil society generally, is really very important in this debate. And when we took on this, the sort of the COP26 role, we set up a civil society and youth advisory council, which has been working with us in terms of looking at some of the key issues, in terms of looking at how we do more in terms of raising awareness of this particular issue. And I have certainly committed that we will continue with this council, and I hope future COPs will have similar sort of setups where they are taking advice from civil society and youth as part of planning for future COPs as well. So we will continue that. But in terms of the piece on the Department for Education, I'm very happy to write back the committee on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, COP President. We'll certainly take you up on that offer of writing on the issue of the Department of Education, and we will undertake to write to BEIS following your good suggestion on the issue of the indicators. Now, Lord Brown, I can see that your question on the net zero strategy has been partly answered. Did you want to ask a supplementary question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, COP President. Yeah, I do. I mean, I would like to stay on this issue of cross-government delivery of our obligations. So, I mean, I welcome too the invitation to help the government engage with the challenge of a set of key indicators. It'll be something for our committee to get our teeth into. I think we'll enjoy doing that. Can I just ask you, in the letter we wrote to you and in the introduction to this session, the Chair made reference to the 9 requests that we made of government departments of how they were engaging with the challenges of COP26 in terms of their departmental planning and strategy. And we got a mixed bag of responses. I mean, some of them were quite disappointing. So, you know, I think, and you would probably agree with this, you know, it would be better if there was an accountability by government departments for the responsibilities that they have independently and collectively. I have to say that even having had the benefit of your evidence and your colleagues' evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, I'm not entirely sure how this machinery at the centre of government works in order to get departments to do that. So I do understand the difference between the committee, the Cabinet Committee that you chair, and the separate Government Priorities Delivery Committee that you made reference to. What I don't understand is how that separate Priorities Government Deliveries Committee works. I mean, is there anyone here can tell us how it works and how it makes sure that these commitments we have, you know, are accepted by Secretaries of State and their department and delivered? And then secondly, it does seem to me that there might be some argument for having in our government something like the framework delivery outcome of COP for government. That is a set of metrics that were applied to government departments that made them accountable, so that there was a transparency of their accountability. I just wondered what your response to that would be.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, look, I mean, I think firstly, in terms of the architecture of government, I think, as I've sort of said to the Environmental Audit Committee, I mean, you know, ultimately, you know, it is the Prime Minister who decides the architecture of government. But what we do have right now is architecture which is focused on delivery, and an architecture which is focused on, if I can put it like this, reaching collective agreement on the policies to deliver on our net zero commitment. So in terms of delivery, obviously individual departments are responsible for delivery of the policies to reach net zero that they have responsibility for. The business department leads overall on net zero. This was the case when I was Secretary of State, and so the Secretary of State now leads on the delivery of net zero across government. To support that, as you said, I mean, there are two elements. One is the Governance Priority Delivery Committee, and that's not just to do with net zero. That's obviously chaired by the PM, but it is looking at all the government's priority missions. So, you know, whether that's on levelling up or education or jobs and skills, health and care, crime and justice, and then of course net zero as well. And the aim of this committee is to coordinate and drive the progress and accountability, and ultimately hold Secretary of States to account for you know, what they're required to deliver through their governments. There is a separate number 10 delivery unit as well, which is made up of officials. And you know, if Peter Hill wants to add anything on this, then you'd be very happy for him to do so. So that's the kind of the delivery element of it. The other is the issue, as you said, there are two cabinet committees. One is the strategy committee, which the Prime Minister chairs, and then there is the implementation committee that I chair, and that's very much looking at you know, coordinating government policy. So you know, we've talked a little bit about the net zero strategy. Well, that net zero strategy obviously put together and led by the business department, but the discussion around what went into that was something that was obviously discussed in quite some detail, and emerged from the work that we did on that Climate Action Implementation Committee. And as I said, it's also a forum for us to look at the international approach that we have on either zero emissions vehicles or energy transition or nature. In relation to metrics, I think you're talking about some sort of framework of delivery. And I think there are two things here. One is, so what I've talked about here is obviously our domestic delivery of our own policies to get to net zero. The other is internationally what is going on. And clearly there are a whole range of ways internationally where a delivery is measured. So as an example, you have the synthesis report that the UNFCCC sets out, and we got agreement at COP26 that there will be a synthesis report produced at the end of 2022, which will set out what progress has been made in terms of those 2030 NDCs. And so there are a range of other mechanisms like that that already exist within the international framework in terms of checking whether those international commitments that have been made by countries are actually being adhered to as well. I don't know, Peter, if there's anything else you wanted to add from the international or domestic side.
I think only to mention, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, what used to be the National Security Implementation Group. It's the Integrated Review Implementation Group. This is the senior officials who meet across government in support of the two committees that the COP president has referred to, the implementation and the strategy committee. So there is a senior officials group brought together by the business department and the cabinet office on a regular basis, which serves that group to ensure coordination and accountability and progress chasing across government.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to make it clear that I wasn't suggesting that we replicate the framework on transparency precisely, but it did seem to me when I was reading the evidence that there was a gap somewhere here, and our experience was there was a gap in performance, and some kind of framework of reporting internally that was agreed that had consistent metrics that would allow transparency and accountability to individual departments might be a good thing. But I'll read your answer carefully and see whether or not that is met with any positive response. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Brand. Lord Whitty, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yes, it's on this this point of the key indicators and the international key indicators, because prior to COP26, the way in which different nations express their NDCs was actually statistically different. Are we now moving to a consistent set of international indicators? And some people remember at the end of the Environment Bill going through the Lords, I was interested in the relationship between reduction in carbon emissions and and economic growth, which of course could be different for nations at different levels of economic development. Is there progress on making the indicators consistent in terms of all those nations that signed up to your agreement?
Yeah, thank you, Lord Whitty. Well, I mean, one of the things that we did get agreement was on common timeframes, and maybe I can invite Alison Campbell, our Deputy Chief Negotiator, to comment on that, because she worked very closely in getting that agreement over the line.
Yeah, thank you, COP President. Thank you, Lord Whitty. So I think there are two elements from Glasgow that speak to this question. So one is the COP President said is the common timeframes issue. So whereas previously, countries were welcome to bring forward NDCs covering whatever time period they wanted, there's now a very strong encouragement that from the next round of NDCs, so post 2030 NDCs, all countries should come forward with 2035 targets. So that gives, a sense of comparability there. And then I think also importantly, through the enhanced transparency framework, as you alluded to, before Paris, there was no, consistent way of reporting amongst countries. In fact, there was a two-tier system where you had developed countries with a very clear set of rules, and then developing countries, obviously in the UNFCCC context, including China, India, and others, having no reporting requirements whatsoever. And so the big thing that we agreed in Paris was that there should be one reporting system for all. And one of the big outcomes of Glasgow was we agreed the rules around what that should be. So now we have essentially adopted a set of common reporting tables, formats, with training programs so that all countries kind of know what they need to do by when and have help in doing that. And there are 60 tables for annually reporting on your greenhouse gas inventories. There's 13 tables for reporting progress towards NDCs, and I think crucially all countries will be reporting on the same data, and so it'll be a lot more comparable and transparent.
think we might ask for that for those tables, or at least a definition of those tables. Lord
Whitty, when we provide those, we'll be happy to provide someone to talk you through this, because it is it's really very, very technical. But anyway, I think the key point, as Alison says, is that there is now going to be consistency in terms of the information that every country provides. So we will be able to see over time whether or not the commitments that they're making are actually being adhered to or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I can see Baroness Boycott has her hand up as well.
Just a very quick one. Are these reports that you are expecting, are they going to be ready by the Sharm el-Sheikh conference?
So it depends, Baroness Boycott, which reports you're talking about. So obviously the synthesis report, the next synthesis report will be, but in terms of the transparency framework, Alison may want to sort of, again, elaborate a bit more on this, but having reached agreement that we would have we have a common understanding now on what needs to be disclosed universally. I think work is now being done by the UNFCCC in terms of kind of the software to bring all this together. So I think the latest by which we would expect countries to be reporting through the transparency framework, I think is 2024. Is that right, Alison?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's to account for the fact that you've got countries like ours who've been reporting this kind of information and data for years, and we're very used to it. And then you've got a number of countries who are literally setting up these reporting structures from scratch, and so need time to be able to develop those and to report. So 2024 is when they're due.
Thank you. Can we now move to the Bishop of Oxford?
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and thank you, Co-President and team, for just echo the appreciation expressed earlier and for your answers this afternoon, which, particularly in the early section, were inspiring in places, really, really helpful. Mike, you've given us a good introduction to the architecture of government, which is helpful, though I have to say it is still somewhat confusing, even for those of us who are trying to work hard at understanding it. And there doesn't seem to be the same clarity about that architecture as there is about the clear achievements of COP, which you outlined. I wonder if I could just test it a little with three hard cases, which we haven't touched on. The first is in the area of communications. Where are the decisions being taken about how to continue to raise the profile of COP going forward, how that competes with the many other agendas the government has, how that is being resourced? The second is to test the engagement of the Treasury with many of the COP commitments going forward. Clearly, there are going to be some important trade-offs in the area of energy. The government's levelling up agenda is coming to the fore as we travel through COVID. How are the Treasury engaging? And the third is actually about the role of the COP president and what will happen when that presidency is handed over. Clearly, it's really helpful for UK government policy to have a cabinet level minister focusing on the environment. Are you able to give us an indication of what may happen beyond the presidency in terms of the place of that leadership within our own cabinet?
Thank you very much for that, Bishop. So just sort of work from the top down. I think the first issue was about communications about COP. And I think by this, certainly what I mean is that we continue to push the COP agenda internationally. I will continue with colleagues to travel during this year as I did last year, and it's about sort of communicating in those countries what we are doing, what the expectation is of those individual countries as well. So that communications will sit within the COP unit itself. I think the comms team actually played a pretty good role, pretty vital role actually, in terms of communicating throughout this last year what we were hoping to achieve. And actually that was not just domestically, but that was a piece of work that was done internationally as well. and we will continue that. So that will continue to sit within the COP unit. In terms of the commitments from the Treasury, so the Chancellor, of course, led on Finance Day at COP itself. And I think you heard from Nigel Topping, there are a number of announcements that were made, including a new requirement for UK financial institutions and listed companies to publish net zero transition plans, basically detail how they're going to adapt and decarbonize as we move towards 2050. There was announcements as well in terms of how you guard against greenwashing, which I think has been one of the concerns that I think some of civil society have raised about some commitments that have come from the private sector. There was a plan set out for that. And I think more widely, it's worth saying that the work that Mark Carney has led during the last couple of years in terms of getting more private finance to commit to net zero, there was quite a lot of support provided by the Treasury in terms of manpower in that work as well. So I think the Treasury has been pretty involved in this particular agenda. In terms of the role of the COP president, well, obviously our presidency will come to an end in Sharm el-Sheikh, so in November this year. And we hand over to Egypt. In fact, later on this week, I and colleagues are going to go to Egypt to agree with them the sort of the joint working that we're going to be doing over the next year, particularly in terms of the commitments that we have obtained, how we try and get countries to deliver on that. And we've had a very good working relationship with Chile, who were the COP25 presidents, and we want to have the same thing with Egypt and indeed with the UAE, which have the COP27 presidency. In terms of what happens, once our presidency year comes to an end, I can't answer that question. That's not within my gift to answer. I mean, all of these issues are matters for the Prime Minister, but there is no doubt that as a government we are very committed to this whole agenda, and I think as a government we've talked about Global Britain. My personal view is that I think what we did through the work on the Glasgow Climate Pact shows it has given for me sort of a very clear indication of what Global Britain is all about, which is pushing a domestic agenda but also leading internationally. And whatever format there is, I'm quite sure the government will continue this leadership after we hand over the presidency to Egypt. I don't know, Peter, if there's anything you want to, or Nigel wants to comment in terms of the finance piece and the work of the Treasury.
No, I think you've covered it. The MDB part is going to be very important in the year ahead, the multilateral development banks, and encouraging them to carry on with doing what they're doing. There's also a very important piece coming this year, without getting too technical, with the IMF on the issuing of and the determination of how they're going to allocate these special drawing rights. Yeah. Particularly the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is extremely important to a number of developing countries for giving them access to finance. And we worked with the IMF and Kristalina Georgieva in the run-up to COP26 with our Treasury colleagues in starting to shape how that fund might work and what size it might be, how it might go beyond traditional measures of vulnerability to include those countries who are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. And I hope that between now and the spring meetings in April, we'll see some further progress on that. So I think that will be another area that the Treasury will be working closely with us on in the coming weeks and months.
Baroness Young, did you want to come in on this one?
I did actually. I kind of wanted to hark back to some of the previous answers about international coordination. I mean, there's been a lot of controversy post COP26 as to what the whole shooting match actually looked like in terms of degrees of temperature increase. And, a strong feel that even with perfect implementation of everything that was agreed in Glasgow, that we would probably not even hit 2 and certainly not hit 1.5. We've talked a bit about what you see as your role in the presidency in delivery, but is there a role also ongoing in the presidency on what next, what else, what's the gap between what's been delivered by Glasgow and what needs to be delivered to hit the 1.5 and keep it alive?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very good point. And I think one of the things that obviously we have got agreement on is this issue of the ratchet, where countries will look again at their 2030 emission reduction targets. But of course, you know, if I can put it like this, sort of every COP builds on what has happened in previous COP. So I don't think the expectation was that you know, the full solution would suddenly emerge in Glasgow. You know, I'm sure we will make progress at further COPs on this. And I think, as Alison was saying, when it comes to future NDCs as well, there will be an opportunity for countries to set out their further plans in terms of emission reductions. I mean, the other thing I would say is that you know, we have seen, I mean, the Paris Agreement is working in the sense that you know, before Paris, you know, the general consensus is we were heading to 4 degrees plus in terms of global warming. And I think, as you just said, Baroness, we are now, you know, assuming that countries deliver on all the commitments that they've made, we are on target to below 2 degrees, you know, not yet at 1.5. But I mean, that is something that will come at future COPs as well. But I mean, for me, what is really important in the short term is that we see progress on the commitments that have already been made. And I think this is one of the big asks, particularly from civil society, is that it's great to have the commitments from countries, but actually that then also needs to be delivered in terms of implementation.
I was wondering if it's worth Alison saying what's in the ratchet, just so that, because there's actually quite a lot there. So when we say countries need to deliver on their commitments, the commitments are for us all to do better. And some of those are, they need to do better on their long-term strategies. Some need to do better on 2030. Some need to do better on policies. Some need to do better on all of them. But if just in a minute, perhaps Alison could just say what's actually, when we say the ratchet, what are the elements that we're talking about?
Very happy to do that. And just to pause for a second on the significance of the ratchet, as the COP president said, you know, this was one of the key outcomes, that countries would come back in 2022 to look at their NDCs and align them with the Paris temperature goal. Because under the Paris Agreement, actually the next time countries would have come back to the table would have been in 2025 to look at their numbers after 2030. And that would have been, as we know from the science, too late. So this was a really significant agreement. And then, you know, there were a few elements that we got through the cover decisions. I mean, one was in the first place to strengthen the commitment to 1.5 degrees. I think that was very important, including recognizing that this requires 45% cuts on 2010 levels by 2030, which is the first time any numbers of what's required on emissions reductions have been quoted in the UNFCCC. So again, that was pretty significant in setting out where we need to get to, that there is a gap. We've got language saying there's, you know, accelerated action needed this decade, the commitment to come back in 2022, and which in effect kind of added an additional ratchet to the Paris Agreement. And then also as part of that, we agreed a mitigation work programme starting in this year, where for countries to work together to look at how we can increase ambition over time. COP president's already mentioned a yearly synthesis report. So every year we'll have a check-in on where we've got to in NDCs. Also a yearly ministerial, and to add that kind of political element that countries will be, you know, coming back together at ministerial level to look at where we've got to. And then also in 2023, there will be, you know, a leaders moment. The UNSG, UN Secretary General has committed to bringing leaders together in 2023 to look at progress alongside, you know, what's called a global stocktake, which is a big moment where the world's going to come together to look at where we've got to in relation to 1.5 degrees and the Paris temperature goal. So, I mean, what we're essentially doing is creating these kind of pressure and transparency mechanisms, and where countries will be under scrutiny on how they respond to that. And then just one other element that was a new thing in the Glasgow Climate Pact, aside from the coal phase down, which the COP president's already mentioned, is a commitment to come forward with long-term strategies towards net zero. Again, that's in 2022, and that had not been, the words net zero had never been used before in the UNFCCC, and that will also have a synthesis report attached to it. So for the first time, we'll be able to see, which countries have come forward with those long-term targets and how they're aligning them with their 2030 targets. We'll have a technical process underpinning that, and we'll be able to also look at it at a political level. So it was some quite significant steps forward.
Yeah. If I may just add one other point on this, in terms of breaking this down in terms of those 2030 emission reduction targets, I think we can put countries in sort of different buckets. So there are those countries that announced a more ambitious NDCs with emission reductions at COP, but which have not yet formally submitted to the UNFCCC. So I'm talking about countries like India and Brazil, for instance. We would want them to do that. There are countries that have obviously announced various sectoral policies which may not be reflected in their current NDC. So we would be encouraging them to include that in any kind of revision. There are countries which already have NDCs which are aligned with the Paris goals, but I think what we would want to see more from them on is particular sectoral initiatives or what more they're doing in terms of delivery. And then there are a set of countries that frankly have submitted so far substandard NDCs, and we would want to see improvements from them. So I think the approach that we take will be different depending on where a particular country is in terms of its current NDC.
Thank you. Perhaps we could now go to Lord Colgrave to follow up on that matter.
Thank you, Chair. And President, actually, my question has been answered in very large part, both by yourself and by Alison. But if I can ask it nevertheless, what are your expectations for revisions of 2030 emissions targets at the end of 2022 by some countries? And what work are you doing to support these revisions? I think really what I'd like to hear is how empowered you feel you are in terms of supporting the revisions. And perhaps you could just put a little bit more explanation about the application of the ratchet too.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of how empowered we feel, I mean, almost 200 countries they agreed to I mean, basically they've all signed up to looking again at their 2030 emission reduction targets if necessary, and I think that is something certainly we will be reminding countries of. As I said, we are putting them in. Certainly, the way I'm approaching this is that there is going to be a different approach depending on where any individual country is in terms of NDCs. But this is where I think we also want to work with other partners. I mean, one of the ways that we were able to get this agreement over the line was actually to work with a range of other like-minded countries in encouraging others to show more ambition, and that is something that certainly paid dividends going into and at Glasgow itself, and that's a mechanism that we want to continue with. So it's not just the UK pushing together with Egypt, but actually getting other partners as well to encourage countries to do that. I mean, in terms of the ratchet, I don't know if there's any more you want to say, Alison, in terms of that.
I don't think there's too much more to add beyond, as I said before, what it gives us is that transparency mechanism. All countries have signed up to this. It will be very clear which countries have increased their NDCs. That will be produced in a synthesis report towards COP. And then at COP, countries will be expected to step up and be accountable to what they've done. And it'll all be very clear. And that's where the kind of pressure for countries to act will come from, and that's broadly how the kind of ratchet mechanism will need to work. And I might add as well, that's not just in 2022. I think the synthesis report will carry on in 2023, as will the ministerial. So I think it's continued pressure until we get to the point where we are meeting the Paris temperature goal, and that was very clearly one of the objectives of the small island states and the least developed countries in particular.
If I may just sort of set out two other quick points on this. So I think the other aspect of this is how do you support countries, particularly some developing countries, in terms of delivering on their commitments. So I think Nigel and Peter talked about the energy transition deal that has been put together with South Africa. I think one of the things that we will want to look at this year is if there are other countries that might be similarly supported as part of their clean energy transition, which then, of course, the quid pro quo is that they need to do more in terms of emission reductions. And I think certainly South Africa now has an ambitious 2030 NDC, and there's $8.5 billion worth of support, which is going to be provided to support them in that transition from coal to clean energy. And the second thing to say here is that as we did during these last 2 years, is to use moments in the international calendar to actually drive more ambition. So the Peter Hill talked about G7, G20. We will be doing the same thing again. So we'll be working with our colleagues in Germany who have the presidency of the G7, and of course Indonesia for G20, work with them. But there will be other moments as well during this year, the UN General Assembly, CHOGM, where there is an opportunity for countries to come forward and set out more ambitious plans. So again, that is a mechanism of working that we used, I think, quite successfully during the last year, and that's something that we would want to continue to work on during this year as well.
Very much. Nigel, did you want to come in again?
Yes, Lord Crocker, just really to emphasise that as well as all that momentum in the policy-making realm of national governments, I mean, the race to zero in the private sector is really on. So, most of the NDCs that exist don't include the highest level of ambition that we see in the market. I've mentioned the EVs. Very few NDCs have a phase-out date of 2030 to 2035 because the market's just moved faster than most governments have been able to keep up with. So I think that annual ratchet is also an opportunity to take advantage of market momentum, whether it's driven by policy or capital markets, so that more NDCs are close to the level of ambition of what is possible as well as what is needed. And I know anecdotally from some of the business leaders in Denmark, for example, they've already started that annual review process, and they're expecting that to lead to a significant increase in ambition at the headline policy level next year, because everyone's aware of how fast things are moving. So I just want to emphasise that there's really fast movement in the private sector as well, which is helping drive more ambition in the public sector.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chair.
Lord Whitty.
Yes, I want to ask about agriculture. And clearly agriculture is pretty important, both in domestic terms and emissions terms, but also in terms of international trade and the relationship with the food chain, and in terms of adaptation as well as mitigation. You've got in the checkpoint process fairly well developed programs in relation to power generation, road transport, steel, and to some extent hydrogen. Are we going to see a similar checkpoint process for agriculture, and are we going to see it rapidly?
I think the answer to both of those is yes, but perhaps I can ask Nigel to elaborate.
Yes, no, good question. One of the things which we commit, we had the Glasgow Breakthroughs Committee with lots of, I think, 45 governments getting behind and saying in the sectors that you mentioned, the objective is to deliver those technologies, those breakthrough clean technologies, cost competitively to the whole world by 2030. Agriculture is on the to-do list this year. In the high-level champions team, I've got a commitment to work with the IEA and IRENA on that, on the Glasgow Breakthroughs report this year. And one of the things we'll be weaving in is agriculture. I mean, I think the best indicator of the direction would be the launch of the Regen 10 coalition, which is a private sector initiative, but focused on mobilising 500 million smallholder farmers to move towards regenerative farming practices around the world, investing $60 billion a year and getting 50% of the global food production to be regenerative by 2030. So that's a private sector commitments. So the job in terms of the Glasgow breakthroughs will be to work together between public and private to converge on a headline commitment that we can all drive towards for 2030. So that's on the to-do list for this year.
Right. And thank you. I mean, there is, as you know, a rather a long time scale on agriculture, and there is some confusion about agricultural policy at the moment. So the more rapidly we can get a framework developed here and internationally, the better, I think.
Thank you, Lord Whitty. Can we now go to Baroness Boycott?
Sorry, thank you very much. Yes, I want to move on to talking about adaptation and what will be happening over the course of the next year. I mean, after the outcome of the Glasgow talks, there was a brief by, in fact, Carbon Brief, saying that not enough money was being pledged by the international community for all the necessary adaptations that have to take place. Can I get your reactions and feedback to that? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Baroness Boycott. So, look, I mean, I said this sort of earlier on in this discussion, but one of the things that I was constantly reminded of is that adaptation historically has not had the same level of focus as mitigation in COPs, and I think to a certain extent we did redress that balance. Of course, you can always go further. So in terms of the piece on finance, firstly, we did get agreement that developed nations would double the amount of finance going to adaptation by 2025. And this was a big ask of many of those countries that are on the front line of climate change. For them, the mitigation piece is less of an issue than the immediate need to deal and adapt to the climate change that is happening. So in 2019, according to the OECD, around 20 billion of the 100 billion of the just under 80 billion that went on supporting developing countries, 20 billion of that was for adaptation. The agreement is that it'll be 40 billion by 2025. And we also saw actually a record-breaking fundraising for both the Adaptation Fund as well as the LDC Fund. So I think in terms of finance, we certainly made quite a lot of progress. And I can tell you that we had some challenging discussions with some of the donor nations in terms of pushing this agenda forward, but in the end we were able to get agreement on this. On the wider piece on adaptation, I think what we also got agreement on was this 2-year program on the global goal on adaptation as well. Alison may want to talk a little bit more about that. And then again on sort of loss and damage, again, I think this was the first COP where there was a significant prominence given to this in the cover decisions. We agreed the functions of the Santiago network, which is again one of the things that we said we wanted to do, as well as a commitment for funding support to fund the functions of the Santiago network. And I think very importantly, we've also got agreement on the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage. Again, looking at what are the arrangements in the future for funding activities to avert and minimize and address the whole issue of loss and damage. Again, this will be sort of led by the SPs, but I don't know if Alison, you might want to say a little bit more in terms of the global goal work and also the Glasgow dialogue work.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, and just say I think the kind of the 3 broad issues and tensions that you've already identified, COP President, are firstly the political attention around adaptation in terms of developing countries often feeling it's not being given enough urgency and that they don't feel listened to in terms of its importance. And I think you've already covered that. And also the second issue being around the money and the funding, which you've already covered. But the third issue is very much around it's more about the practicalities of how do you actually improve the situation on the ground, which is obviously quite difficult to do through an international agreement, and has kind of been a source of contention for years in the UNFCCC. And I think, you know, one of the main issues is it's much harder to design and measure adaptation programs than it is mitigation programs. There's no kind of net zero or 1.5 equivalent, and it's much more context specific. So it's not the case, you know, like in mitigation, a ton of carbon emitted in one place is the same as a ton of carbon emitted in another place. And in adaptation, that's a very different context. So what we had through the Paris Agreement was this global goal on adaptation, which essentially says we need to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability. But the question that's been around since then is, okay, well, what does that actually mean? And how can we give effect to that through the international system? So there's obviously a number of different views around that. And so what we did in Glasgow was agree this 2-year work programme where parties will work together on those issues of what does this actually mean and how best to work together to achieve it. So, for example, you know, getting advice from the IPCC, looking at whether metrics can be established to measure progress on adaptation, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, you know, best ways to share best practice between, you know, similar contexts. How do you do that, knowing that, you know, things will work in one country and not another? So it's really a space, this work programme, to tackle some of those really tricky issues and try and work through how the international system can best support adaptation at the UNFCCC level. And there's going to be 4 workshops this year. It's a 2-year work programme and 4 next year. And, you know, there's a process for submissions where parties can set out their views, and then the conversations will be ongoing throughout the year. So that's the global goal on adaptation and the work programme that we launched in Glasgow. And then on the loss and damage side, on the Glasgow dialogue. So obviously this was kind of born out of a tension that again is long-standing on financing for loss and damage and funding for loss and damage, with some countries wanting, you know, a financial mechanism and other countries feeling that that's not possible. And so what we managed to do was get countries to agree to a dialogue where we would discuss future funding of loss and damage. So again, some of these tensions can be brought out, and countries can work through what's possible and what the international system, and particularly the UNFCCC, can best do to support that. So again, as the COP president said, you know, this is an example of each COP being a step in the road, and these conversations will need to be taken forward. But I think both of those were quite big steps. And then certainly as somebody who's been in this process for quite a number of years, it was the first time I've really seen these issues be tackled in quite such a head-on way. Even if we didn't get everywhere we wanted, I felt like there was a lot more understanding around the issues, and countries were working together, you know, much more closely on them, which I hope bodes well for next year and beyond.
Thank you very much. I mean, I could go on with questions, but I'm very mindful of the time. So thank you, and hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Baroness Boycott. Baroness Young.
Yes, sorry, I think my brain is working about 3 minutes in arrears due to recess issues. Can I just go briefly back to agriculture before I move on to my own questions? I was quite surprised that you, President, deferred to Nigel Topping for a response on that question, because the reality is that quite a lot of global agriculture is driven heavily by subsidy, damaging subsidy, and unless that's resolved, you know, individual producer efforts are going to be greatly hampered at a local level. So though it will be great, and I can't contemplate the size of the number that Nigel Topping talked about in terms of small scale producers becoming regenerative by 50% of them becoming regenerative by 2030. But the reality is, even if in this country, the rate of pace of change of our own subsidy system is not going to get us to being 50% regenerative by 2030. So what is happening to resolve this issue of damaging subsidies at a governmental level, as well as any producer initiatives that were of the sorts that Mr. Topping talked about?
Yeah. So, well, Baroness, the reason I asked Nigel to talk about that is because he's been the one who's been working on the sort of breakthrough agenda. at that sort of international level as well. I mean, just in terms of domestic policy, obviously, I am not responsible for domestic agriculture policy and the whole sort of discussion around subsidies. That is a matter, obviously, for DEFRA. I'm sure the DEFRA Secretary of State would be happy to write to the committee and set out his current views. But in terms of what we are trying to do as part of the COP agenda, I think this has been one of the issues I've always been very keen to make clear, is that what we are doing is trying to drive action across almost 200 countries. Obviously, the domestic piece is vitally important, but that isn't something that kind of the COP unit has responsibility for.
Thank you. Shall I move on?
Barbara, before you do, can Peter, Lord Lily's got his hand up. Peter, did you want to come in on this question? You're on mute, Lord Lilly.
Sorry, not on this question, but when the next gap occurs.
Well, why not now? Because there's a gap before the final question, which Barbara's going to ask.
Right. Maybe it's just to get back to sordid reality. The one change since COP26 is that the cost of heating bills in this country has become a central issue. One proposal to mitigate that effect is that the Treasury should suspend the climate levies for a period. One objection to that is that that would remove the incentive those climate levies have to economize on energy and thereby reduce emissions. Yet even if we do suspend them, given the increasing costs, the incentive to save energy will be far greater than it was last year, when we had lower energy prices plus those levies. So can you think of any reason from the COP26 point of view to object to the Treasury taking on board financing those levies rather than leaving them on the household bills?
So, Lord Lilly, I know you are with great skill trying to tempt me to set out what the government ought to be doing domestically. I mean, I would, with respect, I want to leave this to the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, and the Base Secretary of State. I mean, what I would say to you, I think there are sort of two issues here. One is exactly as you say, there is been a significant increase in wholesale gas prices. I mean, 300-400%, whatever the increase has been in that over the last year, and there is a short-term issue that obviously the government is looking at in terms of supporting particularly the most vulnerable consumers. I think there is a separate discussion in terms of what is our future energy mix. And when I was Base Secretary of State, one of the things we set out was a 10-point plan, a Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and one of the elements of that was to do more nuclear. And to basically increase that base load with more nuclear. And obviously you've seen more recent announcements that have come from the government in terms of plans to support more nuclear. I mean, I know there have been various arguments made about whether we ought to be doing more in terms of gas exploration. I mean, the only thing to say is that that isn't going to change the short-term impact in terms of gas prices. So, I mean, just in terms of domestic policy, you'll forgive me, but I mean, that's something that I think I would like to leave for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to opine on.
Very wise. Thank you.
Perhaps we can move back to Baroness Young for the final question.
Thank you. Can I just talk about the relationship between COP26 and COP15, with the benefit that we've now got that COP15 part 2 is after COP26 and we know the outcomes. Is there a process for building the nature and biodiversity elements from COP26 into COP15? And what chance is there of getting some of the things that were announced in Glasgow into the ratcheted up NDCs, the national adaptation plans, the long-term strategies, the emission reduction targets, all of those instruments to take forward the nature and biodiversity elements that were announced at COP26.
Yes, thank you for that, Baroness Young. So, I mean, there's obviously a very clear linkage between the issue on climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think I've certainly argued that it's two sides of the same coin ultimately. We were able to get actually some pretty good set of commitments on nature at COP26. And I mean, I just want to pay tribute actually to Lord Goldsmith from your house, who has been leading on this agenda as part of COP, and of course continues during our presidency year to lead on this. And we've got a commitment from over 140 countries, representing over 90% of global forests, who've signed up to this Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which was at the World Leaders Summit. And the aim is to reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. There was, of course, agreement also between the Prime Minister and President Xi some time ago that we would work together in terms of COP26 and COP15 as well. And I think there is a real opportunity for us to build further in terms of what we got over the line at COP26. So we are very keen to push for a high ambition outcome at the CBD COP. We want to ensure that there's an ambitious global biodiversity framework as well. And ultimately, this is all about sort of bending the curve and biodiversity loss by 2030. I mean, that's the overall objective of this. So, that for us would include ensuring that more ocean and land is protected, that we're seeing ecosystems restored, that we're seeing species population sizes recovering, and of course halting species extinction as well over the coming decades. So I think there are, if I can say, there are three priorities that we have for our work on CBD. One is, and I think this is a very important piece of this, is securing commitments from countries to mobilize more finance, so both public and private finance in terms of supporting nature. And you will have seen the commitments of, I think, up to $14 billion in terms of supporting nature that was announced at COP26 itself. Secondly, going back to this point about accountability, I think what we want to see is a framework which is going to include some pretty strong accountability mechanisms. So, that was very important for us as part of COP26. I think it's very important as part of the COP15 as well. And then increased commitment on this, on the sort of 30 by 30 a plan that is being signed up to by governments, ensuring that you're protecting at least 30% of your land and 30% of oceans globally as well. So that's kind of the objective. And there is work that has been going on, both actually ministerially, but also particularly at official level in terms of these linkages. I mean, I don't know whether Peter Hill wants to speak a little bit about the work that's been going on between the two conventions.
The three. I can briefly talk about that. So obviously, if the conventions are working well, then they're working towards a similar objective, which is to preserve habitat so that they can both serve biodiversity and climate, and the funding and the monitoring. And so at what you're trying to achieve broadly speaking, you're trying to achieve the same thing through a number of mechanisms. And one of the things we've been trying to do over the last 2 years is to try and, while respecting the fact that each of these is a different convention with its own framework and all that, that they're talking to each other, communicating, cooperating more. So that's what we've been trying to do through the Rio Convention Linkages Programme. I think there have been a few meetings, maybe I think there were 3 last year, and maybe the one before, there's another one due in February. So that's to try and bring the secretariats, the presidencies, the Global Environment Fund, which sits across the 3 conventions, to align, to have a common story about what they're trying to achieve, so that there's a coherence at both ends, both in what you're trying to achieve and the conventions and the countries who are trying to achieve it, recognizing, as the COP president has said, these are distinct and they'll have their own mechanisms and they have their own targets. And we're not planning to import biodiversity targets into the climate change space. That wouldn't be useful or helpful. But when you're talking about nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, private and public sector funding for these, it's in a sense all one ball of wax.
So could I just check from Peter? There are no specific mechanisms that are going to take the commitments from COP26 and insert them into the text for COP15.
Well, there's no, so, parties to one are parties to the other. And so one of the reasons for trying to bring together the nature and the biodiversity communities and politics and all the rest of it is so that we're arguing for consistent things in each framework, but each framework has its own processes, procedures, and we have to respect those. The reason for progressing the linkages work is so that at the level of secretariats and presidencies and funds, there is as much alignment as possible between what we're trying to do on the Convention on Combating Desertification, Biodiversity and Climate. But in the answer to your question, there's no formal mechanism for automatically lifting the outcome of one convention into the other. And I think it would be quite hard to achieve that. This is about ensuring alignment and that the parties are progressing towards a common aim, as far as that's relevant, towards a common aim through each of the conventions.
Thank you.
There is a couple of minutes left. Baroness Northover, if you're very quick, you might be able to slip one in.
Thank you. And this is picking up on a point that the President and Nigel Topping both made, and that was about the role of finance and what Mark Carney in particular did. I thought that was dramatically different from what had happened before and potentially transformative. I wondered if you could indicate your optimism for continued leadership in this area.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, look, I mean, I think what we have seen actually over the past few years is a sort of a significant change from business overall, where we have a business advisory council as part of the COP26 work. And we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and one of the CEOs of big international business said that a few years ago you would have been an outlier if you were talking about green issues and trying to reflect that in your business. Now you're an outlier if you're not talking about those issues, and I think you've seen that in the finance sector as well. The key issue for me is that, yes, you've got these commitments from countries, from financial institutions. I think about $130 trillion so far committed to GFANs to go to net zero, and again on sort of science-based target. The issue is how does that money actually get deployed to support climate resilient projects, obviously in developed nations, but also in developing countries as well. And there are a number of strands of work that GFANs is doing. One of those is how do you get deployment of this finance in developing countries as well? And that's work that's being led by the CEO of Macquarie Bank as well. So I think what we will see, is more development in this issue. But there is no doubt there is a very clear commitment from the financial services sector and indeed business generally, recognizing that actually, ultimately going green is good for the bottom line as well. And I think, Peter talked a little bit about this as well. I think there is further work to be done during this year in terms of also getting the multilateral development banks to also play their part. I think one of the issues that we've had for private sector deployment of capital has been around the fact that what happens in terms of losses, so initial losses, if there are any. And I think one of the things that certainly would be very interesting is for more work to be done by the MDBs in terms of first lost capabilities and facilities as well. So, but I think overall, what I would say is that I think we have seen a big sea change. So, $130 trillion is around 40% of the world's financial assets, and that is something that was sort of put together over, just over a year. So it shows. So I mean, for me, certainly that is incredibly encouraging. But the key thing now is how do you connect that capital with climate resilient infrastructure and projects around the world.
Thank you for that response. Thank you for the last question, very helpful, Baroness Northover. Can I now bring this session formally to a close, and in doing so to thank the COP President and his 3 colleagues for his very open responses to us today. As you take forward your ambitions to deliver your agenda for the remainder of the presidency, I hope we can stay in contact, and we will certainly be working alongside the Commons to maintain an ongoing scrutiny of your work. And we thank you for your cooperation today. So on that, again, thanks, and I formally close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
The proceeding has ended.